staff, and then they went up to McNamara, and McNamara rejected the plan, and that was the end of it. So it never got put into effect, but the fact that you can get all the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the senior military officials in the U.S. government signing off on a plan that outrageous is extraordinary to me.
Fast forward again to August 2nd, 1990. Iraq attacks Kuwait, claiming the Kuwaitis are slant drilling into Iraq's oil fields. U.S. President George Herbert Walker Bush pushes for a land war against Iraq, but polls show the U.S. public is split 50-50 on that idea. Then comes this eyewitness testimony before a congressional committee from a 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl. The claim is she cannot be identified for fear of reprisals.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, took the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor.
The U.S. public is outraged. The result? Support for land war zooms. It's a turning point. Desert Storm is launched. 135,000 Iraqis are killed. An estimated 1 million Iraqis, many of them children and old people, then die as a result of 10 years of sanctions. One small problem. There never were any incubator baby deaths, not one. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's investigative flagship program, The Fifth Estate, reveals the girl to be the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter, given her lines and coached in acting by the giant American PR firm Hill & Knowlton. It's one phase in a $10 million joint U.S.-Kuwaiti campaign of deception. This man is lying.
I myself buried 14 newborn babies that had been taken from their incubators.
This man is lying.
And they had kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators so that Kuwait could be systematically dismantled.
There were a lot of people who participated in a conspiracy. Yes, an out-and-out conspiracy of fake organizations, false documents, fraud, and disinformation. So, if a new man named Bush is in the White House and helps engineer a brazen deception in order to achieve global geopolitical goals as well as domestic and personal ones, it wouldn't be a first, would it?
Hello again. What I did not tell you before was that in the course of my research, I discovered that Colin Powell was a habitual liar. In the run-up to Gulf War I, Colin Powell testified that he had satellite photos of 2,500 Iraqi tanks on the Saudi border ready to invade. A St. Petersburg Times reporter went to the Russians and bought a satellite photo of the area. Not one single tank. Years later, when questioned by reporters, Powell admitted there were no tanks, that in effect he had lied. And for those of you who do not remember, Colin Powell was the officer who covered up the My Lai massacre.
Repeat after me. I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly
When George
swear.
W. Bush took office in 2000, he brought with him Vice President Dick Cheney, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and Deputy Secretary for Defense Paul Wolfowitz, all of whom had served together previously in the administrations of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Paul Wolfowitz, in particular, had long been recognized as the intellectual force behind a radical neoconservative fringe of the Republican Party. For years, Wolfowitz had been advancing the idea that the United States should reconsider its commitments to international treaties, international law, and multilateral organizations such as the United Nations. a radical plan for American military domination first surfaced during the administration of George H.W. Bush. In 1992, Paul Wolfowitz, working in the Department of Defense, was asked to write the first draft of a new national security strategy, a document entitled the Defense Planning Guidance. The most controversial elements of what would later come to be known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine were that the United States should dramatically increase defense spending, that it should be willing to take preemptive military action, and that it should be willing to use military force unilaterally, with or without allies. This new reliance on military force was necessary, according to Wolfowitz, to prevent the emergence of any future or potential rivals to American power, and to secure access to vital resources, especially Persian Gulf oil. Out of power during the Clinton presidency, Wolfowitz and his colleagues affiliated themselves with a number of influential conservative think tanks. In 2000, they would craft yet another proposed national security strategy, this one published by a right-wing think tank calling itself the Project for the New American Century. At its core, the document revived the Wolfowitz Doctrine. It called on the United States to increase the military budget by up to $100 billion, to deny other nations the use of outer space, and to adopt a more aggressive and unilateral foreign policy that would allow the United States to act offensively and preemptively in the world. The elimination of states like Iraq figured prominently in this grand vision. But even these hardline conservatives knew that the Wolfowitz Doctrine was likely too radical to win the support of the foreign policy establishment, their own Republican Party, and the American people. In their defining document, written in September of 2000, a full year before 9/11, they acknowledged that the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent, in their own chilling words, some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor. 1 year later, that event would arrive.
David Von Kleist is a host of the popular radio program The Power Hour. He's the maker of the new film, 9/11 in Plain Sight. All right, David, please come out here. Welcome.
Before I start, I want to thank any of the listeners that we've got out there of the Power Hour for helping to keep us on the air. How many listeners do we have out there? I know there's a few of you. I thank you. And the listeners know that this is going to be a team effort. If we're to get the information out about what truly happened on September 11th, we have to somehow overcome the mindset and the brainwashing that's been subjected upon the American people for not just the past several years, and not just the past several decades, but for several generations. Right off the bat, I'm going to say a word. We're going to play some word association. I want you all to scream the first word that comes to your mind. Are you ready? Conspiracy theory. Now, there are two words in that phrase. The active word is theory. By definition, a theory is an idea, a supposition, a concept. Here's an example. In theory, if I purchase a raffle ticket, I could win a prize. Now, as long as you don't buy that raffle ticket, that win is theoretical. But once you buy one raffle ticket, it becomes a possibility. And the more raffle tickets you purchase, the more possible and eventually probable your win becomes. That's what it is with a conspiracy theory. When you have no evidence, it is a conspiracy theory. But once you have one piece of evidence, no matter how circumstantial or flimsy it may be, it becomes a possibility. And the more evidence you gather, the more possible and eventually probable the conspiracy is. Now, we have to keep this in mind when we look at all the information about September 11th. Now, about 6 weeks ago, I released a documentary film called 9/11 in Plain Sight. Curiously, thank you. Curiously, there were some individuals that somehow found a way to write a review on this documentary 3 weeks before it was released. They said all kinds of things, said like this was manipulated footage. Yeah, that's what it was. It's doctored photographs. Yeah, photo workshop. That's the ticket. Yeah. I assure you that what you see on that video is unmanipulated, unaltered video footage and photographs. So let's put that to rest right away. For those of you that have seen the documentary, I actually held the DVD from CNN entitled America Remembers right up into the lens of the camera. And yet some still say it was manipulated footage. There are some folks that just don't want us to consider the possibility that maybe there was something other than a terrorist with a box cutter in his hand that was responsible for slamming planes into targets on September 11th. Now, you've seen some of the clips here about the Pentagon. 2.5 years ago, I wrote an article called From Deception to Revelation, and I was summarily raked over the coals for even having the audacity and the unmitigated gall to suggest that something other than a 757 had hit the Pentagon. People said I must have been some part of a COINTELPRO operation. Artichoke, that's what it was. And now, and I don't even want to bring up some of the websites out there that claim to want to know what really happened. Some of them really want to snoop around to find out what's really going on. You could figure it out. But when people look at these videos, the video clips in 911 in plain sight, the big question comes up, Dave, you're saying that no plane hit the Pentagon, and maybe the planes were switched that hit the towers. Wait a minute. What happened to the plane? You have to tell me what happened to that plane. Where are those people? You must have some sort of an idea. Well, yeah, I do. And if I came forward with that idea, it would be a conspiracy theory, wouldn't it? The whole point of the Project 911 in plain sight was to stick with video evidence and photographic evidence and ask questions. And that's all we did. Boy, some people really hate it when you ask questions. And for those of you that continue to ask the question, well, you have to tell me, where's the plane? Where are the people? I don't know. But let's consider this. Let's say you put a loved one on a bus here in New York, and they're going to go to Boston. What's it, about 5.5, 6 hours? Something like that. So you take them down to the Greyhound bus terminal. You put them on a Greyhound bus. They get on the Greyhound bus. They sit in the window of the Greyhound bus. Right over the logo says Greyhound bus. They wave to you on the Greyhound bus as it leaves the Greyhound bus terminal. 5.5 hours later, we interrupt this program to bring you a terrible news bulletin. Seems that a Greyhound bus has lost control and slammed into City Hall at Boston. There was a big explosion and everybody was killed. And of course, there's terrible mourning and memorial services and all kinds of terrible things go on. Well, about 2 weeks later, somebody comes up with a photograph or a video of the bus just before it hit the City Hall, and you know what? It says Trailways on the side. Question, where did the Greyhound bus go? Do you know? I don't know. But we look at the information and the physical, the photographic, and the video evidence, and they scream the questions, where did those planes go? Because they sure as hell didn't hit the Pentagon, and whatever hit those towers has a very serious question as to whether or not those were commercial aircraft at all. This is where we are with this investigation that needs to be started right now. Now, I want to ask the question, thank you. Take a look around you. Do you see any cameras from CBS, Channel 2, Channel 4, ABC, Fox, CNN? Are they here? No, they're not. You want to ask the question, why? Why is it, and I grew up here in New York City, I grew up in the Village, I grew up in Brooklyn, I watched those towers as they climbed their way into the sky. And when I saw them come down, it hit me very hard because this is where I spent my wonder years. And I have to ask the question, why is it that now I live in a very rural area? I live in the center of the country. I'm out in the middle of flaming Nowhere, Missouri, a little town they call Versailles. Merci beaucoup, monsieur. And I want to know, how is it that me and William Lewis, the director, can go down there with tons of videos that were sent to us by our listeners, and again, I thank every single one of you for sending us the videotapes, because without your help, the video project would not have been possible. The networks will not provide video footage, they will not provide releases, and they will not allow America to see this video footage because some guy got on television a couple months after September 11th and said, We got to stop showing all these video clips of America being attacked no more because we need time to heal. Once you see these video clips in slow motion, you'll understand why they won't show them anymore. And for those of you that are curious, go to the Borders or the Barnes & Noble and buy the CNN disc, America Remembers. The video clips are right there. Now, I don't want to take too much time. We're running really late, but there's a couple of points that need to be made. First of all, let this be seen as no political football. We have one party in this country. It is the U.S. corporate party with subparty A, Republicans, and subparty B, the Democrats. We have to understand that the largest industry in this country is the defense contracting industry because it includes communications, agriculture, industry, technology, and anything else you can name. And war means money. We don't have a Cold War, and we don't have the Russians to have boogeymen anymore. China is our biggest trade partner. The United States is the world power. We don't have a boogeyman. Well, golly gosh, don't you think they need to create one? So I have to go back to where I started. Conspiracy theory. I will now give you an example of a conspiracy theory. On September 23rd, Condoleezza Rice had a news conference, and she stated, and I'm paraphrasing right now, she said, "We have definitive proof that links Osama bin Laden and the Taliban to the events of September 11th, and we will release that information in due time." To this day, we're still waiting. We have not seen one piece of evidence that links Osama bin Laden and the Taliban directly to the planning stages of September 11th. And when you have no evidence and you charge somebody of conspiracy, that is a conspiracy theory, isn't it? The only difference is if you're George Bush and company in the United States government, you get to launch not one, but 2 wars half a world away, kill tens of thousands of innocent men, women, and children, and contaminate the entire region for 4.5 billion years with depleted uranium. I don't know what the solution is, ladies and gentlemen, but the silence is deafening from the mainstream media, and I think that the only thing that we have to do right now is to mount a massive million-man media march in every city across this country and scream, "We want the truth." And I will finish by making the same statement I made at the end of my video, and I will ask you all, where is your line in the sand? Thank you very much.
Good evening. I'm glad to be part of this very important event, which is made possible by Nico's invitation and Jimmy's video. I would like to use my time to talk about the 9/11 Commission report, which is the present subject of my research. Many people have asked me, how good is the report? Well, that depends on your perspective. If you're one of the average Americans who get their news about 9/11 from the mainstream media, you will probably think the 9/11 Commission report is excellent. This seems to be the opinion of people who write customer reviews on Amazon.com, almost all of them giving it 5 stars. Some of them praise it by saying, "It reads like a novel." Well, that's true. I myself would give it 5 stars if it were correctly categorized, that is, as a work of fiction. We are told in the preface that it was an attempt to give the fullest possible account of the events surrounding 9/11. Now, of course, they can't quite mean that. There were trillions of events surrounding 9/11. They meant they were going to give an account of those that seemed relevant to understanding 9/11. So that means there had to be a principle of selection. That principle of selection would be based upon your perspective. That is, your basic theory about what happened on 9/11. There are, of course, 2 basic theories of 9/11. Both of them are conspiracy theories. One of them is the official conspiracy theory put out by the Bush administration,
according to which the attacks were planned and carried out entirely by Al-Qaeda, inspired by Osama bin Laden. The other account, which is the alternative conspiracy theory, suggests that the attacks were made possible by the complicity of the Bush administration itself. In the preface, we read that the report is intended to be impartial, but it is definitely not impartial as between these two theories. The Commission began its work simply by assuming the truth of the official theory. It did not argue for that theory. It simply assumed its truth from the outset and throughout its work. And it uses this theory to decide which events are relevant. We're also told in the preface that they intended their work to be independent and nonpartisan. Now, by nonpartisan, they meant that the committee was made up equally of Democrats and Republicans. Even this claim isn't quite true, because the chairman of the commission is a Republican, and even more importantly, the executive director is a Republican. And this executive director, Philip Zelikow, is not just any old Republican. He was a member of the National Security Council of the Bush I administration, where he worked with Condoleezza Rice. Then, during the Clinton years, when the Republicans were out of office, he and Condoleezza Rice co-authored a book. And I have co-authored a book with somebody, and I know you have to be very good friends and you have to share almost all beliefs in common. He then worked for the transition team for the National Security Council for the transition between the Clinton and Bush administrations. And finally then, he was appointed to Bush's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. So the commission is definitely not independent, if you mean independent from the White House, because the executive director represents the perspective of the White House. Now, why is this important? The executive director directed the work of the staff, and the staff of the commission, not the commissioners, did almost all the work. And as director of the staff, he decided which lines of inquiry were worthy to be looked into, which subjects should be subject to research, and which ones should not. Therefore, as executive director, Zelikow could direct the staff to investigate those events that were relevant to the official conspiracy theory and simply ignore all events that would be supportive of the alternative conspiracy theory. Some critics, having read the 9/11 Commission report from the perspective of the alternative theory, have called it the 9/11 Omission Report. Well, this is a good name because it systematically excludes virtually every fact supporting the alternative theory. But given Zelikow's role, this should be no surprise to us. Some people have also called it a whitewash, and it is. But this term assumes that the commission should have investigated the White House, that is, various kinds of evidence suggesting that there was complicity by the White House. But given Zelikow's position, any investigation of the White House would have been carried out by, essentially, the White House itself. A more accurate way to put it was that as the White House's inside man on the commission, Zelikow was in position to make sure that the White House, along with the CIA, the FBI, the Pentagon, and the Justice Department, was not investigated. Once we understand this, we will not be surprised by the Commission's omissions.
Christina Borgerson is the author of Into the Buzzsaw, Leading Journalists Expose the Myth of a Free Press, a collection of stories about reporters who acted courageously and discovered that no good deed goes unpunished. She's won an Emmy and a Murrow Award for investigative reporting. Christopher Scheer is the co-author of The 5 Biggest Lies Bush Told Us About Iraq. He co-authored the Oscar-nominated script for the film Nixon. Paul Thompson has compiled the world's most compendious resource of mainstream press stories about the events of 9/11, the complete 9/11 timeline at cooperativeresearch.org. Finally, Dr. Robert Bowman, an old friend of mine, by the way, a man who flew 101 combat missions as a fighter pilot in Vietnam and who today takes a stand against war. He headed the Star Wars programs under Ford and Carter and then opposed them under Reagan. He now heads the Institute for Space and Security Studies. Welcome, everyone. Let me start with Dr. Bowman. What is your assessment of the film clip about the Project for a New American Century that we just saw? Do these guys really have that much influence?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, this bunch not only drew up a plan for the foreign policy of the United States, they also drew up a plan for the foreign policy of Sharon's Likud government of Israel. Both of these plans, drawn up by largely the same people, included regime change in Iraq as a central element. And as the clip noted, they acknowledged it couldn't happen. The American people wouldn't allow it unless there was a new Pearl Harbor. And that is what 9/11 was.
If I could clarify, he's referring to a paper that came out in 1996 called A Clean Break, which was written for Benjamin Netanyahu, the just newly elected Israeli prime minister, and it's written by, I believe, Douglas Feith and a number of the people who are lately involved in this Israeli spy scandal. So David Wormser is another one. So that these, you know, the neocons, we refer to them, actually gave advice to Sharon and also pretty much the same people in the Project for the New American Century.
Paul, what about 9/11? Why is anyone doubting it? Weren't all the real questions cleared up by the 9/11 Commission?
We can see so many instances of conflicts of interest. For instance, Philip Zelikow, who is the executive director, and he was the person who is in charge of figuring out who the witnesses are going to be, where the evidence, and what evidence they were going to look at. He co-wrote a book with Condoleezza Rice, the national security advisor, and has so many ties with the Bush administration. He was part of the transition team, so he actually had to be interviewed by his own commission because he himself was involved in so much of what went on before 9/11. And all of the commissioners are very compromised by conflicts of interest. Quite a few of them are working with legal teams that represent United Airlines or American Airlines. I think half the commissioners. So that's one problem. Another problem is that the final report was supposed to be a unanimous report. So that means that if there was a single commissioner who had any objection about anything, that fact would be dropped from the report. So there is literally nothing in the 9/11 report that the Bush administration did not approve of.
The number of omissions is staggering. For example, they begin the book with a discussion of the hijackers, giving the same 19 that have been named from the beginning. They fail to point out that 6 of those hijackers have shown up alive. They also discuss Muhammad Atta, describing him as a fanatic Muslim, obviously so devout he was ready to meet his maker. They omit the fact, as Daniel Hupsicker has revealed, that Otto was very fond of alcohol, pork, and lap dances. They hardly discuss the World Trade Center collapses. They do not discuss the fact that fire has never brought down a high-rise steel frame building. They do not discuss the fact that the collapses had 10 characteristics that are common to controlled demolitions. They do not even mention the collapse of building number 7, and of course, therefore, the comment by Larry Silverstein, the one who had a lease on it, that he and the fire department decided to pull it, that is, have it brought down by explosives. They do not discuss the removal of the steel, which would have covered up any evidence of explosives. With regard to the crash into the Pentagon, they ignore several of the most puzzling questions, assuming the official theory. That is, why would terrorists have struck the West Wing, which was being renovated, so it had very few people, and when all the top brass and Rumsfeld were in the East Wing? They do not discuss the fact that photos taken by the Associated Press and even by a Marine show that up till 30 minutes after the building was allegedly hit by a 757 going 400 some miles an hour, the facade had not collapsed. They don't discuss the fact that these photos show that the hole that was created was very tiny, that no Boeing could have gone inside of it. They don't mention that photos show there was no Boeing outside the Pentagon. They don't mention that the Pentagon's anti-missile system should have brought down any commercial airline coming near the Pentagon. With regard to Bush's behavior that day, they do not force the question as to why the Secret Service did not whisk him away when there should have been fear that he would be one of the terrorist targets. They do not discuss the most specific of the advance warnings. They did not ask Ashcroft what was the warning he got so that he would no longer fly commercial airplanes. They do not mention David Schipper's report that prior to 9/11, he tried to inform Ashcroft that several members of the FBI were telling him that they knew that attacks were scheduled for that time in Lower Manhattan. They do discuss the put options, but they dismiss it, saying, we found that the man who bought most of the United Airlines put options had no conceivable connection to Al-Qaeda, therefore he could have had no foreknowledge. This is a perfect example of how the official theory dictated what evidence was relevant. With regard to the claim that we were hunting bin Laden prior to 9/11, the Commission fails to mention that he reportedly showed up in July before 9/11 in a hospital in Dubai, where he was treated by an American doctor, visited by the local CIA agent, and the head of Saudi intelligence. They ignore the testimony of Abu Zubaydah, the Al-Qaeda operative who reported that 3 members of the Saudi royal family had advanced knowledge that there would be attacks on America on 9/11, and that a Pakistani general also had this knowledge. Testimony that tended to be verified by the fact that all 4 of those men ended up dead within a few months. With regard to the Saudi flights that Michael Moore made well known in his movie, based on Craig Unger's book, the Commission claims there was nothing wrong with the flight on September 11th from Tampa to Lexington. American airspace had been opened. They leave out the crucial point which Unger had stressed, that American airspace had only been open for commercial aircraft, not for private. This seemed a particularly blatant attempt at deliberate deception. They ignored all the allegations that FBI headquarters had blocked investigations. They ignored Robert Wright's charges. They omitted the crucial element in the Colleen Rowley case, the Moussaoui case, and they omitted virtually every detail of Sibel Edmonds' 3.5-hour testimony. They omit any reference to the fact that the head of the Pakistani intelligence service was in Washington that very week, and that he had ordered $100,000 wired to Muhammad Atta. It ignores the Project for the New American Century, formed by many members that are now part of the Bush administration, with its explosive statement that a new Pearl Harbor would be very helpful. They ignore the fact that many members of the White House, including the President himself, after 9/11, described the attacks as opportunities. They ignore the fact that there were pre-existing plans for war in both Afghanistan and Iraq, and that both of these had to do primarily with oil. I've talked primarily about the Commission's omissions, but there is another remarkable dimension, the revisionism of this report. In Chapter 1, they give us a completely new version, which is actually the third official version of what happened on 9/11. This version is clearly intended to absolve the Pentagon of all blame by portraying the FAA as staffed by incompetent bunglers, ones who couldn't recognize a hijacking when all 3 or 4 regular characteristics